During World War II, the Nazis were hunting a spy they called the most dangerous woman in Europe. They knew she was sabotaging rail lines, freeing prisoners, and helping Allied pilots escape occupied France. They even had a description: a woman with a limp. What they didn't know was that their most elusive enemy was a Baltimore socialite with a 7-pound wooden leg named Cuthbert. Her name was Virginia Hall, and before the war was over, she would organize resistance fighters, derail German supply lines, and even escape across the Pyrenees Mountains in winter on that wooden leg. Most people have never heard her story. Welcome to Not Your Average History, the stories you didn't learn in school, but probably should have. Virginia Hall didn't begin her career as a spy. In fact, she wanted to be a diplomat. But in 1933, while hunting in Turkey, a shotgun accident left her with severe injuries that required doctors to amputate her leg below the knee. She was fitted with a wooden prosthetic. She named it Cuthbert. When she later applied to join the United States Diplomatic Service, the State Department rejected her application. Not because she lacked intelligence, not because she lacked experience, but because she had a prosthetic leg. So Virginia Hall left government service and moved to France. She settled in Paris and began building a life there. But across Europe, tensions were rising. In 1939, war broke out. And in the spring of 1940, Nazi Germany invaded France. The collapse was swift. Within weeks, much of the country fell under German occupation. Millions fled south as German forces advanced. Very quickly, the Allies needed agents who could operate behind enemy lines. And even though the Americans had rejected her just a few years earlier, Virginia Hall volunteered for a new secret organization called the Special Operations Executive, or the SOE. Its purpose was simple: set Europe ablaze. The SOE recruited agents to operate in occupied territory, organizing resistance networks, sabotaging infrastructure, and gathering intelligence. Operating out of Lyon, Virginia Hall began building one of the most effective underground networks in occupied France. At the time, Lyon had become one of the main centers of the French resistance. She recruited resistance fighters, established safe houses across the region, and connected scattered underground groups into a coordinated network. At night, fields outside small villages became drop zones where Allied aircraft parachuted in weapons, radios, and supplies. Hall helped organize those deliveries and made sure the equipment reached resistance cells across southern France. Her network also created escape routes for Allied airmen whose planes had been shot down over occupied territory, moving them from safe house to safe house toward the Spanish border. At the same time, she was gathering intelligence, tracking German troop movements, supply routes, and military installations, and transmitting that information back to Allied command. The information helped the Allies understand how German forces were operating inside occupied France. For months, her network continued to grow, but the more effective it became, the more attention it attracted. Eventually, the German secret police, the Gestapo, began noticing a pattern. Rail lines were being sabotaged. Prisoners and Allied pilots were disappearing from German custody. Resistance fighters seemed unusually well supplied with weapons and radios. Somewhere behind these operations was an organizer connecting the network together. Reports began to circulate, from informants, interrogations, and sightings in nearby towns. There was a woman seen moving between safe houses. The descriptions were never consistent. Different names, different appearances. But the pieces were starting to come together. Every report agreed on one detail. She had a slight limp. Before long, the Gestapo gave that unknown agent a nickname: the Limping Lady, and finding her became a top priority. One of the officers assigned to hunt her was Klaus Barbie. Barbie would later become known as the Butcher of Lyon, one of the most feared Gestapo officers in occupied France. And capturing the Limping Lady became one of his obsessions. For 15 months, Virginia Hall managed to evade him. To the Gestapo, she became something of a ghost. By now, she was at the top of their most wanted list. But in late 1942, the Gestapo had begun dismantling parts of the resistance network in Lyon. The net was closing in around her. Arrests were increasing. Several members of her network had already been captured. If she stayed any longer, she would be next. She had run out of options. The only escape route left was south, Between France and Spain stood the Pyrenees Mountains, a rugged natural border stretching nearly 300 miles across the two countries. The crossing meant days of climbing steep mountain trails and snow-covered passes, rising more than 7,000 feet above sea level. Like many fugitives from occupied France, Hall relied on local guides who knew the hidden smuggling routes through the mountains. Nearly 50 miles of narrow mountain paths stood between her and the Spanish border. Even experienced hikers struggled to make the journey in winter. Virginia Hall would have to do it on a wooden leg. With the Gestapo closing in, Virginia fled toward the mountains. For days, she climbed narrow trails through snow and freezing wind. At one point, she radioed London to report that Cuthbert was giving her trouble. Her handlers misunderstood the message and replied, "If Cuthbert is troublesome, eliminate him." They believed Cuthbert was the code name of a resistance contact. Virginia had to clarify, Cuthbert was her leg. After days of climbing, she finally crossed into Spain. The journey would later be remembered as one of the most extraordinary escapes of the war. But the ordeal wasn't over. Spain was officially neutral in the war, and crossing the border without papers meant arrest. So instead of safety, she was immediately detained by Spanish authorities. Even Allied pilots she had helped escape often faced the same treatment. But as an American citizen, her case eventually reached the US Embassy in Madrid. After several weeks in custody, American diplomats secured her release. After everything she had just survived, most agents would have considered their mission finished. Virginia Hall asked to go back. By 1944, she returned to France, this time working for the American Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. Her new disguise was that of an elderly goat herder. She dyed her hair gray, wore worn clothing, and moved quietly through rural villages tending livestock. Behind the disguise, she coordinated multiple battalions of Maquis resistance fighters. Under her direction, they sabotaged German infrastructure across southern France. Bridges were destroyed, telegraph lines cut, freight trains derailed. Resistance fighters even liberated towns before Allied forces arrived. Much of that coordination traced back to one quiet radio operator working behind enemy lines. Communication was one of the most dangerous tasks in occupied France. Each time Virginia transmitted a radio signal to London, German direction-finding units began searching for its source. If she stayed on the air too long, they could triangulate her location, so every message had to be fast. Transmit, pack up the equipment, disappear before patrols arrived. Night after night, she coordinated supply drops of weapons and equipment for resistance fighters across the region. Without those signals, the resistance could not have operated. When the war ended in 1945, the United States recognized Virginia Hall's extraordinary service. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. She remains the only civilian woman of World War II to receive it. President Harry Truman offered to present the medal in a public ceremony at the White House. Virginia declined. Instead, the award was presented privately. No publicity, no celebration. Virginia later joined the newly created Central Intelligence Agency. But the post-war intelligence world offered fewer opportunities for women in the field. Despite everything she had done, Virginia Hall was largely kept behind a desk. And much of her career was spent working in analysis rather than operations. She retired in 1966. For many years, the details of her wartime work remained classified. Virginia Hall died in 1982. Today she is remembered as one of the most effective Allied spies of World War II. The woman the Gestapo once called the most dangerous of all Allied spies. But most history books barely mention her. Most people have never heard her name, but they should. Virginia Hall, one of the greatest spies of World War II. This is not your average history.